Well, good morning or good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sara Wyant, the founder and editor of Agri-Pulse Communications, and I'm so glad that you could join us for today's webinar. We're going to explore how the EU, the European Union, exports its crop protection policies to the developing world. Today, we'll hear from our distinguished speakers with facilitated questions and answers. I'm going to make some brief speaker introductions and encourage you to dig into their full biographies on our website. We also want to hear from you, the attendees. So please feel free to offer your questions in the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box. We want to make sure that we have an opportunity to hear from as many of you as possible. And if you do have any technical issues, feel free to use the Q&A function for that as well. Our team will be watching and will try to assist you. In addition, I wanted you to know that we're also going to be recording today's discussion, and the webinar will be available tomorrow on agri-pulse.com. So before we start off, I also want to begin our program by thanking our sponsor that made this webinar possible, and that is the Crop Protection Action Coalition for Trade, CPACT. I know you're going to be hearing a lot more about them in the weeks and months ahead. Now, I'd like to welcome our first speaker. He's Macy Merriman. Macy is an independent, Brussels-based consultant providing advice to organizations seeking to understand and participate in policy developments in the European Union related to food and agriculture. His 20 years of engaging with European and global decision makers and stakeholders on some of the most difficult issues related to agriculture help him deliver some useful perspective and advice to clients. Those are all the folks who are out there facing today's challenges and opportunities in the EU's food and agricultural sectors. So please welcome Macy Merriman.
Thank you, Sarah. Over the next 5 minutes, we'll review how the EU impacts farmers in the rest of the world. Diving straight into this, over the last 2 decades, the EU has enjoyed strong popular support in Europe for its policies on food safety and quality. For crop protection, this means that many active substances for crop protection have not been reauthorized, and fewer new products are able to reach the market. This creates problems for farmers in the EU, but also for farmers in the rest of the world. We'll review that issue and mention some of the other EU policies in the Green Deal and Farm to Fork that need watching. Despite the challenges of market access, the EU's 450 million consumers remain a lucrative attraction for exporters. At the same time, the EU's food and ag sector is going through significant disruptions, and it's not certain that it's going to have access to the kinds of innovations that are needed to meet the challenges of the future. So, Catherine, if you please move to slide 2. I assume that we all know how this goes. So this is just a short reminder on crop protection, MRLs, and import tolerances. When the EU does not renew an authorization for an active substance on the basis of health or environmental concerns, the MRLs effectively go to zero, the so-called LOQ. This often puts the EU out of step with the rest of the world, with growers in the rest of the world. Remember that the EU has a very energetic approach to the precautionary principle, and its crop protection regulatory system is primarily hazard-based versus the risk management approach that we see in many world export regions. So what we see happen when an active substance loses its registration in the EU is that parts of the value chain around the world rush to ensure that they no longer use that active substance in their own operations. But we also see that sometimes those organizations or that those operators seek to ban or to ensure that the authorizations are not renewed across their entire country regardless of the potential impact that it might have on productivity for local consumption, as opposed to just protecting the export markets. So you can see how this potentially, or this actually does, have an impact on local production as well. So, but again, remember that there's strong support in the EU for crop protection reductions. Of course, not so much among farmers, but even they, farmers in the EU, when they can no longer use a crop protection product, they're completely willing to put very strong pressure on the Commission to keep MRLs low for imports in order to maintain a so-called level playing field. I think all of this is well known to many of us on the call today. Perhaps a more recent twist is where the Commission says that it's now going to consider so-called global environmental concerns when setting import tolerances for trade. This is something that definitely needs watching. And furthermore, even when the Commission proposes trade enabling import tolerances, as they do and as they're in general required to do because of commitments to WTO and other multilateral trading agreements, even when those are made on the basis of a positive EFSA opinion, so the EU's own scientific advice, we see the European Parliament sometimes is actually vetoing these, as they did with tricyclazole for rice or with thiacloprid for a number of products that use that product. Now, looking at so much for a brief review of the CP, MRL, and IT issue. Looking at the Green Deal and Farm to Fork, if you'll move to slide 3, please, Catherine. This is a very long list. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I just want to point out here that much of what the Farm to Fork program proposed has been delayed or is in work in progress. You can see especially the red here in my explanation. Especially the framework for for sustainable food system, which was intended to be Vice President Timmermans' flagship proposal. This has totally disappeared from the Commission's work schedule. Furthermore, the sustainable use of pesticides regulation is in deep trouble. But I want to emphasize that regardless of what happens with the farm to fork pieces that aren't yet done, including the sustainable use regulation, just the existing EU, the EU regulatory system on crop protection is aimed downwards. There would likely to be more and more non-renewals of existing active substances. And it also remains to be seen if the EU regulatory environment can accommodate some of the really exciting innovations in the pipeline, like crop protection solutions that have the same efficacy as synthetics, but the environmental footprint of biological. Other areas to watch are the deforestation regulation. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, but I'm mentioning this one. I think this one might especially be starting to bite some of the participants in the call. Certainly many export value chains in the area looking at coffee, cocoa, forest products, etc. will already be familiar with this. One that might be below the radar screen, but I think is going to cause, has the potential to cause heartburn across many of our sectors, is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. While this may not directly apply to operations, to exporters around the world, if any of them are selling into one of the approximately 17,000 companies that are expected to be captured by this, those companies will need to be working with their entire value chain, both upstream and downstream, in order to get those value chain growers, participants to work with them on their own sustainability transition. And in turn, that's likely to mean additional constraints for operators wishing to sell into the EU. So to conclude, Catherine, slide 4, please, the last slide. Looking forward, the upcoming EU elections in June are going to determine the future of many of these issues. These elections take place at a time of unprecedented challenges, both, well, geopolitical, economic, and environmental. In agriculture, the atmosphere remains just as tense, with very high levels of farmer frustration, with the Commission's perceived top-down, non-collaborative approach to transitioning ag and food systems in the EU. And I think you see some of this starting to play out in the media in France and Germany and elsewhere just in the last days. The next European Parliament and Commission are expected to look and behave, or could look different and behave very differently than this one. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Macy. Appreciate your comments, and I'm sure that we'll have a lot more as we go ahead. And there we go. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions about your opening comments and what lies ahead. I'd also like to introduce our next speaker, who will be appearing as part of a video. We're very delighted to have Hoang Thi Lien, who started her career as an official at the Ministry of Industry and Trade of Vietnam. She worked in the capacity of executive director at International Pepper Community before joining the Vietnam Pepper Association. She has also worked as director of APEC and International Economic Cooperation Division, and as a director of the ASEAN Division, as well as the Office of First Secretary of the Vietnam Embassy to Malaysia. So please welcome her video.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hoang Thi Lien. I'm chairperson of Vietnam Pepper and Spice Association, VPSA. Today, I want to focus on a point that recently we are facing in export of spice, including pepper, to the European market. So one of the issues is that when we try to align with the European market in order to make sure that our Vietnam pepper export got the market share in the European market, we got to work with the farmer in order to make sure that the cultivation of the farmer follows the good agriculture practices. In that situation, we put a huge job and responsibility to farmer and to make sure that their cultivation are aligned with the market requirement. But in that situation, nowadays, we see that EU have issued very stringent regulation on pesticide residue, and it gets stricter even day by day. And even worse, some EU buyer want that MIL even stricter than the level accepted by the EU in general. So we want to follow the market, but we don't want to, after you follow the market, even put your farmer in a situation that they have nowhere to go. Because if the situation is a very tough, very difficult, and then we don't have any support, including the capacity building, the management, including access to technology and resources, farmer has no ability to follow, to do the rest, because if they don't do, we don't have a product to export to the market. Because in any situation, if you want to build and establish a very sustainable supply chain, you got to put farmer at the center and make sure that they will get support in order to follow whatever the market needs. So that is the situation in Vietnam, that we have a support from the government, we have a support financially from the exporter, but if we don't have the very close engagement from the buyer, from the market, especially the European buyer when they are issuing the more stringent regulations, so we will not have a confidence that we will ensure that 100% of our farmer will be able to survive and follow that compliance requirement and procedure, and we want everyone happy and to make our crop, our pepper, our commodity more sustainable. I think that is the point I want to highlight. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Han. We appreciate your input on this important topic. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Lucy Namu, the Senior Principal Analytical Chemist at the Kenya Plant Health Inspectorate Service. She has over 25 years of experience as a biochemist, having worked in the area of laboratory analytical services and accreditation as a food safety expert, and now works in the Trade and Standards Office. Ms. Namu is also currently serving as a developing country expert as part of the Standards and Trade Development Facility. So please welcome Lucy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the warm welcome and the opportunity to just share with you a few thoughts. I'm currently also working at the Kenya Accreditation Service, which is the sole accreditation body for Kenya. Next slide, please. Today, I want to focus on developing countries' perspectives with regards to MRL, in particular focusing on Africa and some of the experiences that we have had. Next slide, please. It is clear that within the African continent, 90% of the countries really depend on agriculture to spur growth, and this has been the practice with a focus also on export. However, it's becoming more difficult with limited access to plant protection products, which are critical given the large complex paradigm of the pest combination that exists within the tropics. So adaptability to new technologies and regulatory approaches is also very critical. One thing we do know within the continent, many countries use Codex as the reference MRL. Codex MRLs are the reference MRLs to support trade, with different approaches being used, currently emerging with regard to MRL deferrals. Why? Because the different territories that African countries are exporting to would either have missing or misaligned MRLs, which are a challenge, especially with regards to the minor crops that are exported by many farmers. So in this case, there has been a need for a strategy to develop capacity, to have more plant protection products, to develop more plant protection tools for farmers. However, with few registrations that do exist, and for the specific plants and crop combinations, they have become a challenge, especially in Kenya, for the minor commodities that we export, for example, French beans, which we find are the top 3 exports that we have. The top, of course, will be our traditional tea and coffee, but now fresh fruits and vegetables are gaining in traction, given the favorable conditions that we have to grow and the competitiveness that we are able to supply these fresh fruits and vegetables all year round. But the main challenge of the lack of MRLs is really affecting the minor crops market access. And we see that there has been a lot of changing regulatory environment, whether it be with regards to withdrawals of plant protection authorizations, and of course, approaches that are now developing with regard to sustainable and sustainability approaches required in production. Next slide, please. So the classical problem that we have dealt with and that really became a challenge for many of our farmers were exports of beans and peas with pods from Kenya to the EU market. Many of the MRLs of the pesticides that have been used are actually missing. Many have now become candidates for substitution due to different approaches used in risk analysis. Whether it be with regards to different approaches in toxicological evaluation, different approaches to residue definitions, different approaches to actual derivation and calculation of the residue itself, compared to the way that Codex, of course, defines and derives the residue. So with this, there has been a lack or a need thereof to replace residue data, toxicological data with new trials, new data being submitted to actually support establishment of an MRL. However, the risk management decision has led Kenya to actually have many of the pesticides withdrawn, which are not now any longer available to farmers. In 2016, we started with just 3 pesticides being withdrawn. The list has now grown, and the link is provided to just give the impact of what missing MRLs or withdrawals and lack of renewals of the pesticides in the target market, which is the EU, has meant for a developing country like Kenya. Next slide, please. So these challenges abound divergences, of course, in the risk-based approaches, while the EU used the hazard-based criteria. This has always been a sticking point in the actual elaboration and definition of MRLs. Availability of plant protection products for minor crops, especially those in developing countries and registered for use within countries, is really limited for farmers, which poses a challenge of increasing pest pressure. Crop grouping, while we have internationally agreed upon within Codex crop grouping approaches, there is limited flexibility in its applicability, which is resulting, of course, in missing MRLs. And in many cases, those commodities affected are minor crops. But data pooling has been an opportunity. However, establishment of MRLs takes time, and it is not always a guarantee that there will be acceptance of the data generated. With the emerging issues, of course, now with environmental sustainability, the sustainable use of pesticide regulations coming up in the EU, we see that posing another challenge, because it just means that the EU is removing more and more pesticides without new tools coming into the market for farmers to use. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So initiatives regionally or globally have been really focusing on coordinated data generation, with challenges, of course, with regards to availability of the actual data and recognition of that data. Regional harmonization efforts have been going on within the EAC. Misalignment and missing MRLs has meant that some of the pesticides have been dropped. So farmers have less and less toolkits, and of course, some of these pesticides are no longer supported, which means that really farmers have less and less options and less competitiveness. The discussions going on at the WTO, at the international arena, the WTO SPS committee, really looking at policy approaches, harmonization, mutual recognition of arrangements for data, some of the international work going on, have really taken time. Unfortunately, at the same time, it means that the market share gets less and less, and this is a challenge for farmers, especially in Kenya. Next slide, please. And I think those are the points that I wanted to talk about, just opening our eyes here, and I look forward to hearing a lot of feedback from you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lucy. We look forward to some additional digging into the situations that you're facing in Kenya. Next, we're going to have another perspective, this time from the West Coast. We're going to hear from Neil Nagata. He was the president of Nagata Bros Farms. His family has been growing strawberries for over 3 generations near Oceanside, California. He is also the past chairman of the California Strawberry Commission and past chairman of the San Diego County Farm Bureau. So please welcome these comments from Neil.
Good morning. My name is Neil Nagata, and I'm a farmer in Southern California. My family's been growing in Southern California for over 100 years. We grow strawberries, blueberries, and cherimoyas, and we take pride in what we do. Through the years, we've advanced in technology and have used different chemistries that have been less toxic and more beneficial to people and the environment. And even though we have the EPA and California EPA, when we try to enter into markets internationally, we're challenged by the different MRL standards, and that makes it very difficult for us. With the population around the world ever increasing to be over 8 billion people, we need to provide healthy and safe food. And we know with all the science that the food that we produce is safe, and it is beneficial to the people who consume it. Fresh fruits and vegetables have been known to be one of the great benefactors of human population. And it is really something that we're trying to strive for. And the challenges, not only from our local governments, but from the international governments to try to get our produce to market just makes it one thing more difficult. And we're trying to stay in business, which is ever challenging every day. And we keep working so that we can provide a great tasting, safe, and abundant food source for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. And I see that we have at least one question that's been entered already. So please enter your questions in the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen if you have some additional one for each of our speakers. Next, it's a pleasure to introduce someone who's no stranger to many of you. Has been a friend for a long time. Lloyd Day has assumed his position as Deputy Director General of the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture on July 1st, 2012. Time flies, I guess, when you're having fun. It's been a while. Day started his career with the governor of California, eventually becoming the Assistant Secretary of International Trade and Investment of California. He moved to Washington, D.C. to serve as administrator of USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service and then head of federal government affairs at Syngenta. Please welcome Deputy Director General Lloyd Day.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's nice to see you and good afternoon to everyone. First slide, please. The next slide. There we go. First of all, a short introduction on ICA. ICA represents the Ministers of Agriculture, the Secretaries of Agriculture of the Americas and the Caribbean. So it's 34 delegations. We include Spain as well as our foot into Europe, where we actually had our Director General there this week and last week, trying to work on behalf of the farmers and ranchers of the Americas to access that market and to maintain that market. We engage in technical cooperation programs through all of our offices and all the most common things that any Ministry of Agriculture will be conducting. And so why is this important to have in the Americas? It was founded in 1942 by Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture of the United States. And if you look at the statistics today, the Americas from north to south is about a quarter of global food production. It's about 1/3 of all the exports in the world, and it's 50% of the biodiversity. So the Americas is really the guarantor for global food security. And it's important that we have a voice in discussions with the EU because they're a huge import market. At ICA, we try to serve as a bridge to the rest of the world. So we represent the Ministers of Agriculture of the Americas, and we take them around the world to global fora such as at the FAO, Codex Alimentarius, the WTO, the WTO SPS Committee, and the OIE. So just last week, there was a global forum on food and agriculture in Europe. 65 ministers from around the world went to Germany, and then we went on to Europe to just have discussions with the European Union on some of these rather prickly issues that we have with them. Next slide, please. So you've all seen the slides that talk about the targets for sustainable food production in Europe, a 50% decrease in pesticides and fertilizers and antimicrobials, and a 25% increase in organic farming. Those numbers obviously are not science-based, and that's our big concern with the whole EU Green Deal and the impositions they're putting to us on MRLs is that they are not science-based. So a few years ago, Brian Christie, our friends up in Washington and in California, did a study to see what the impact would be if these MRL procedures were put in place on exports from the Americas. So this is just from Latin America, and just in the top 3 export products from all the countries listed in the first column there, but at the end you'll see that the total impact could be 24 billion euros. That's an enormous amount of trade. If you add North America to that, it's $40 billion. $40 billion of trade being impacted that would go from the Americas as a whole to the rest of the world. So obviously from a Latin American and American perspective, we took this very seriously. So if you could go to the next slide. So in 2019, at our ministerial meeting, led by the United States and by ministers of agriculture from across the Americas, we endorsed something called Resolution 520, which dealt with our commitments to pesticide-related provisions in the WTO agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures. So in 2019, we united the world through ICA to send a signal to the European Union that they must base their policies on science. This resolution resolved to affirm the importance of the work by the WTO SPS Committee, by Codex Alimentarius, by all the internationally embraced science-based fora that were created by the European Union, but now they're throwing aside with some of the legislation that they're putting forward in the EU Green Deal. So we thought it was very important to bring all the ministers together. And this really began a journey that we've been on for the last several years through this pandemic in order to stand up for farmers. The next slide, please. So just after the meeting that united everyone on science-based standards, the UN came to ICA and they talked about food systems transformation, and that eventually led to the Food Systems Summit that you all know about. Well, when they came here to ICA to launch this proposal, there were hundreds of people here. It was a really nice event. They're talking about food system transformation, but there wasn't a single farmer in the audience. There wasn't a single food company. There wasn't a single minister of agriculture, at least from our hemisphere. And so we developed, working with all the ministers of agriculture, as well as the productive sector from Canada to Argentina and the Caribbean in between, we produced documents that we took to the UN Food Systems Summit that said, this is the position from the Americas. And we think we at least changed their narrative for the moment. And those 16 messages were based on three fundamental principles. First is that farmers need to be a part of this discussion. They need to be valued. They need to be supported. The second is that science, not political science, needs to be the foundation of public policy. And the third is that agriculture should be viewed as part of the solution to our climate crisis. Next slide, please. So we presented that document to the United Nations Food Systems Summit. And then in working with our ministers of agriculture, we thought, the next step in this is to take these messages to the COP27 and just recently to the COP28 in order to make the presence of agriculture felt, as well as the presence of the Americas felt. And so we went to Sharm el-Sheikh in 2022, and out of about 40,000 people there were maybe 400 farmers. That's not a huge representation in that kind of discussion, in which the world is pointing at agriculture as one of the main culprits for emissions. But it was a step in the right direction, and that led to our next participation, if you can go to the next slide, which was in the COP28, which, working with the agricultural sectors across the Americas, we had for a second year the presence of agriculture ministers, as well as farmers and ranchers from across the Americas and around the world. Farmers from around the world ended up coming to this pavilion because they found it to be a farmer-friendly pavilion in which we were articulating the benefits of agriculture. The fact that we are now, I think, in what is a new green revolution. We're at the cusp of a revolution in agriculture, which is really going to change the way we produce food and how we impact the planet. So while everyone's trying to say, including the European Union with some of these MRL restrictions, that we should go back to the days of organic agriculture, the United States and the Americas are embracing innovation and technology in all of its forms, from artificial intelligence to informatics to life sciences. And the combination of all those is going to create a new revolution in agriculture, in which we are going to be able to produce more with less and do it with less impact to the environment. In fact, restoring. And so these are the messages that we've been taking to the world. The Director General of ICA took it to Europe last week. He just returned. His initial prognosis was that they're not necessarily listening to us yet, but I think if they open the doors and look at what's on the streets of a lot of the capitals of Europe this week and last week, they can see that they need to talk to their own farmers too. So together, working with farmers in Europe, perhaps we'll make a dent in some of this, these policies, so that the goals are fine, but they need to embrace science around those goals. And so we're trying to work with all the ministries of agriculture and department secretaries of state and foreign ministries as well to try to get these messages clear in our conversations with the European Union and with European farmers, because I think those can be potentially our best allies in order to have a more science-based policy in the European Union and around the world in international forum. So with that, I think I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Lloyd. Appreciate your overview of all the important work that you're doing. And now I'd like to invite all of our panelists that are still with us to come back onto the screen so that we can take your questions. And I'm going to start with just a couple of my own. And, talking about just the global environment that we've seen, it's certainly been impacted by the war in Ukraine and now with Israel and Gaza. There's certainly a lot of very difficult factors around the globe, and some of them, especially post-COVID, you'd think would be a strong reminder of why we need good food systems and science-based standards. But do you think these huge conflicts like the war in Ukraine have really shored up those opinions, or have they had any impact at all? And Macy, I'd like to start with you and then see who else would like to jump in.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. At least from what I would call a European perspective, I think that both the pandemic and now the conflicts that we've seen with the disruption of global supply chains I think they've reinforced both an awareness of the need to maintain strong and resilient supply chains for strategic materials generally. And we see this with the strategic materials that are going to be required for the green transition in the EU, minerals and things like this, rare earths, but also a reawakening of the strategic importance of food value chains, of food supplies, and the importance of trade in maintaining those. I think that was a first reaction. A more maybe that was moderated after a period of time by people's realization that it's probably important also to consider how to ensure that there's an appropriate amount of, I don't want to say strategic autonomy, because it wasn't really talked about in terms of autonomy, but having fallback systems or having other systems to ensure that maybe Europe can't afford to be as reliant as it is on certain trading partners for certain of these strategic materials. Now, when it comes to agriculture, I think Europe is in a much different position, because it has much more of a balance between its trading relationships when it comes to agriculture. But even there, I think that it really the big difference that I saw was that all of a sudden the grower groups were around the table. They were being sought out. They were being almost commandeered to come in and to work with the authorities to be sure that there was going to be enough food supply, both during the COVID crisis and in the aftermath of the disruption to the grain trade. And I think that this finally, in the last 18 months, we've seen agriculture and food production get the kind of high-level attention that it deserved, as opposed to being just pushed off on the side. While a lot of EU stakeholders were saying, we need to do the green transition, we need to do the sustainability transition, and it's almost as though the farmers didn't have much of a look in. Now I think they have much more. And as Lloyd said a little while ago, they're actually getting more and more upset about what's been foisted on them, or their perception of what's been foisted on them in the Green Deal, and they're really looking to make themselves heard. In many of them are saying yes to the transition, but not if it comes entirely out of off of our back, out of our own pocket. We need to be made whole. We need to be brought in. We need to be consulted and do this in a sustainable way.
Lloyd, you want to jump in on this one too, on what you're seeing? Obviously, you're getting some more farmers to the table.
Yeah, farmers are coming to the table. What was interesting in COVID, and thank God that we had this pandemic during a time of video conferences and of Zoom, so that we were able to communicate with ministers and with farmers and with everyone else in the private sector about making sure that agriculture was viewed as essential, and that our farmers, our ranchers, our entire supply chain could be working through this entire process in stores and in ports and everything else, so that we can get food from one place to another. An important component of all this that needs to be remembered is trade. And I'm afraid sometimes that people think because of these crises, we need to restrict trade more, when the opposite is actually true, in order to both supply the world and supply it efficiently and at a cost-effective price, but also to take care of our environment so that we grow the right food in the right places. And so, as Macy was saying, and I see a transition potentially happening, that people are going to embrace the importance that technology brings into the production of food in order to make it more sustainable, in order to use less land and to use less inputs, rather than go back to the days where we'd have to, have more land and deforest more forests in order to produce in a way that is not technologically advanced. And so I'm optimistic about the future, but we do have, certain barriers and certain conflicts that we have to overcome. It was good to see in the Summit of the Americas that they put food security on the table. It wasn't on the table at first, but the war in Ukraine really forced it to come onto the table, and I think it still remains on the table, but we have to be vigilant, and farmers have to be vocal in ensuring that it is, and not just farmers, but the entire food chain that depends on the abundance of agriculture.
And Lucy, have you seen a greater recognition of the appreciation of farmers as a result of some of these conflicts that we've been experiencing globally in your country?
Yes, definitely. I think looking back at the time of the COVID pandemic, one of the things that really did shake up the export value chains was the access to the market, the transport, or of course, transportation systems became grounded and limited, therefore limited trade was happening. Incomes then got affected and quite a number of people lost their livelihoods. Fast forward to now, I think with the war going on, we have just realized the vulnerability and the need to improve our food production systems, look at more innovative ways in which we could increase, indeed have more from less land, that is the holding of the smallholder farmers, but improve productivity and using innovative approaches, like now, what the government is focusing on, trying to get more farmers involved with lower cost of inputs, looking at that as a way of spurring, productivity within the country so that we don't rely so much on the food imports that we have in the past, especially the grains that we still rely on heavily. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We're starting to get a few more questions in from the audience, and one of those is for you, Lucy, asking about with strong pest pressure that you have on your crops, and I'm sure that if farmers don't have the ability to use these, they might be at risk of losing their entire income for a year. What kind of research is being done to come up with alternatives to pesticides that the EU can accept? Are there biologicals or biopesticides also in the market in addition to the traditional crop protection chemicals?
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a lot of work now going on in the use of biopesticides or safer placement, lower risk pesticides at the end of the growing stages of food, so that especially for the food that is minor crops that does not necessarily have a lot of products registered, biopesticides are becoming more and more researched upon so that they could be substituted into the production systems that have traditionally used the conventional chemical pesticides. The pest pressure is really, it's horrendous, because now we have to look at the other side. If it's not the residues that you're dealing with, it is, of course, the pests and, the regulated pests that are not wanted in the markets that you're trading in. So, yes, there's a lot of that. There's also looking at research into whether really there could be alternative gaps for the existing pesticides that are still in the market, so that the adjustment of use patterns could perhaps yield lower pesticide residues that could then make the product a little more user-friendly for especially compliance issues. So there is a mix of the research type that is going on. There's work also supported by the STDF with regards to replacement of pesticides with the use of biopesticides. Thank you.
Thanks. Macy, you mentioned just some of the different regulations, for example, a regulation on deforestation of commodities. And we had a question that came in from Yuman Chen asking about what are the thoughts on how do you harmonize and then validate all these different goals that they're trying to achieve, and can we have an apples to apples platform of analytical methods of what's being done in various regions?
Well, really interesting choice of words, the harmonization and validation. I think already harmonization is going to be a real challenge because the goals that the EU is looking at relative to indirect land use change, for example, deforestation, the timeline or the dates for deforestation that they'll be looking at are already, they'll need to be broad, I think, buy-in on those, but especially on when it comes to validation of methodologies, but I think especially data, collecting the data, tracking the data of where the different components of shipments coming into the EU, where they came from, which parcels they came from. Were those parcels deforested before or after? I forget what the date is, but I think it's sometime in 2020. Those sorts of, that kind of stewardship and due diligence, I think, is going to present real challenges for parts of the sector. I know that my understanding is that the EU is at least aware of some of that and is looking at, for example, identifying entire regions that are at high risk of illegal deforestation, medium risk, or low risk. And so as an exporting region, trying to ensure and be able to demonstrate that one is in the moderate risk, or even better, is in an area of low risk of having been deforested recently, I think there should be ways to optimize that and to facilitate trade. But I think it's still going to be a challenge for the verification process across. It boggles my mind when I think about it.
Lloyd, is that part of the role that you're trying to play in bringing all these different countries together and trying to find that at least common ground?
Sure, we're looking at all that, and as Macy was talking, I was just reflecting on some of the speeches I've heard and the literature I've read, that some of the goals of the European Union are great, but some of their actions are really having the exact opposite consequences. For instance, their reduction in dairy herds and livestock herds is actually going to increase greenhouse gas emissions multiple times versus what they were actually producing because of the efficiency of their own dairy farms and livestock operations. And so it's really having a negative effect on what they're doing by their discontinuation of utilizing certain crop protection. All that's going to do is add to more deforestation, because they're going to need more land to grow the crops, because you don't have the scientific tools that are safe, and they're proven safe by their own agencies to produce food that is safe for their consumers and safe for the environment. And so there's really unintended consequences with what they view as very important, very laudable goals, but the unintended consequences are in fact worse than what they're trying to do. And so I think we need to have a conversation with them at a high ministerial level and with their farmers as well, so that hopefully we can adjust and find some compromise in what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and another question came in from Mahela Grad. The question deals with that what we're hearing is that there aren't a lot of effective ways to lever or influence what's happening with the EU, but with your experiences, what are some of the most impactful arguments that could potentially change the position of EU policymakers? Macy, you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure, I'll take a first go. I think there are two things that come to mind at least. One is appealing to good old-fashioned self-interest of the EU. So finding the arguments and finding especially the stakeholders in the EU that are particularly affected by a particular piece of policy, and working with them to ensure that they have the tools and the data that they need, and are especially motivated to make their voices heard in Brussels, in their member state capitals. So I think the motivating, again, enlightened self-interest of EU stakeholders is an important piece. And then secondly, I think that just this the kind of demonstration to the EU in a thoughtful and balanced way, the ways in which, for example, if one finds that a particular policy proposal is actually going to be detrimental to the interests it's intended to serve, as Lloyd was pointing out, that sometimes happens. Pointing that out in a way which is not ideological or polemical, but rather is focused on data and is demonstrable. I think that the EU is a big monolith. It's not a big monolith, okay, but there are parts of the EU that are able to be swayed by data-driven arguments. There are other parts that are ideologically driven, just like in any society. But I think it's finding those that are open to and willing to look at evidence-based policymaking. There are plenty of those people in the EU. They haven't always been in decision-making positions, and some of the policies that happen in the EU happen for political reasons, just as I think is true in any complicated political environment. But I think working on that evidence-based decision-making and policy-making is a second important piece.
Lucy, I wondered if you have some insights from your discussions with EU leaders on this.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah. I think just following on to what Macy said, we've seen that a lot of data has actually supported some of the arguments that we've had. I mean, looking at what is available in terms of what the problems that we are having to deal with, the type of pest dynamics that we have, the options that we use in mitigating, and looking at really what then could be the substitutes with all that. The discussion, especially with growers with similar dynamics within I wouldn't call them like type, but within the southern belt of the European region that has active production, may have yielded in the past some kind of coalition in terms of similar challenges that we're facing. However, data is always a challenge. It's a moving target, we always say, because once you get to a certain point, there's another dynamic to be looked at. So the more the data that you do get, the more that it demands of you to keep getting to the point where you actually have what you would call a solid basis. So that is always the challenge. But looking at the problems where we've started, I think our main challenges did start from around 2012 right up to now, if it hasn't been the issue of looking at pests and the science behind managing pests and pest problems and pesticide, it's always been that balance to look at which way to go and what are the leeways that we could get. Thank you.
All right, Lloyd, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, it's a real challenge. I don't think the consumer understands pesticides and crop protection very well. And so a lot of the politicians make their decisions based on what they say is consumer preference or choice, even though the consumers really don't necessarily know what they're talking about. So I think it's kind of a three-pronged strategy that you have to have. First is the data. We know that data is there and science is there on behalf of what we're trying to do. The second is the communication of that in a way that people can understand. Marketing, so to speak, having had the experience of coming from the checkoff programs, those are some things that really work with American consumers. And so maybe we need to think about how do we do something working with a global audience that we have a better communication about the benefits of agriculture, how agriculture is part of the solution, how science is helping to solve a lot of the problems related to agriculture, the climate, and other things. And then the third is good old-fashioned politics. You know, if prices rise because of wars or because of pests and things like that, consumers start getting angry. And we're seeing some of that change in Europe right now. And so maybe those politics combined with some of the other marketing and just relationship development that we're trying to work on, we might be able to achieve some results. But it's an uphill battle. It's hard to get people interested when so few people actually understand farming anymore.
Yeah, that is the case when we're less than 2% of the population in the United States and in so many other countries, except in areas where we just don't have this appreciation anymore in the US of the disconnect between what shows up in the grocery store and what's produced on the farm. I'm going to have this as the last question. It's from Jay Vroom, who many of you know, and he makes a couple points about how biotech and crop protection innovation adoption in the US has been so beneficial in terms of productivity, good for the environment. And he's curious as to whether or not you'd respond to this notion that the departure from science-based risk assessment in the US has been enabled by the extraordinary subsidies that the EU farmers enjoy, so that they perhaps don't have to be as competitive on adoption of new technologies. So Macy, I'm going to throw that your way and see if you have some comments on that.
Yeah, I'm taking a minute to gather my thoughts on it. I mean, Jay's question is, it's something that goes deep to my heart because that's the side of the business that I come from, the seed side of the business, especially. And it's a real tragedy to see that that the EU wasn't going to raise the or lower the drawbridge and let these products in. I think that regardless of what the situation was in the past with EU subsidies, increasingly they're going to be predicated more on the environmental and other public services that they bring, and less on simple area payments in the EU. And I think that either way, European farmers want to be on the forefront of innovation. They want innovation that they can sell to their consumers, to their customers, and they want innovation that's going to be sustainable and it's going to help them on their farms. But I think that the GM wars kicked off at a really unfortunate time for the faith of consumers in the safety of the food supply in Europe. But I think that yeah, one of the I wouldn't say almost buying off of EU farmers was that, sure, they continue to get their subsidies, so perhaps they do have to be a little bit or they can afford to be a little bit less competitive, but nonetheless, a lot of them who are actually at risk of going under right now would say even that isn't enough to help them. So they really need the tools that innovation can bring to help them meet the challenges of the future, and they would be adopters if the regulatory system will allow it.
And I'm guessing, Lucy, the farmers in Kenya want to be as innovative and adopt new technologies if people would let them.
Yeah, well, it's a dicey situation, but I want to throw this. Looking at all of what's going on, I think the challenge that started all this was risk communication. The understanding on what really would be safe, what is safe, and therefore, when risk assessment was taken into out of context, into the hands of those who wanted to perhaps blow it out of proportion, I think this is where we started losing traction on the whole thing and started taking off in the area of hazard-based criteria and away from risk analysis. Coming on to new technologies, I think there's always the skeptical way of looking at it, a precautionary approach, but really, if it has been shown to improve on food security. So this is one area that I think the world is moving to, innovative approaches to enhance food security. There would be, of course, there are benefits, but I think we got somewhere lost along the way when, risk communication became a little too difficult and didn't kind of sit right into the minds of activists or leftists, or that is where we started losing the war, as you like. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that perspective. And I really like to thank everyone for participating today. Thank you for your questions. I know we didn't get quite to all of them. One was where to look for more information to stay on top of this issue. And that's a pretty easy one for me to answer, because you can go to the Agri-Pulse website and keep up with all the news as we follow these important issues. I also like to thank once again the Crop Protection Action Coalition for Trade for sponsoring this webinar. And as I mentioned, if you missed any part of it, feel free to go to our website tomorrow. If you're already registered, you'll get an email that tells you when the video is posted, and then you can watch any parts of it that you might have missed or share with your friends as we keep the conversation going on the importance of this topic. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.